Hey everyone, this is going to be part one of at least 2 videos where I go over my Homelab setup. So I already made a video going over my network rack and the hardware that's in there, and this is going to deep dive on the 2 old Dell enterprise servers I have running in there and what I use them for and why you'd even want to have a Homelab in the first place. I'm going to focus in on TrueNAS, so that's what I have running on that Dell R510. NAS being network attached storage, so basically a bunch of space for me to store stuff on and host things. So I'm going to dive into that. This isn't really going to be a tutorial on how to set that up. There's lots of great content out there on YouTube and the internet on how to successfully set up a TrueNAS installation and run it properly and maintain it and everything. There's more going to be hopefully some inspiration on why you'd even want to do that in the first place, how I set mine up, what I use it for, and maybe more importantly, mistakes I've made and how I would do it differently. So to start with, I'll go back in the room with the rack and show you those 2 machines just as a refresher so you have some context for the hardware we're running. And then we'll hop back here and I'll show you the setup and go over what I've got.
Okay, so for some context, this is the hardware setup. I've got this Dell R720 and a Dell R510. In this video, I'll refer to this R720 as the Proxmox machine, and I'll refer to the other one as the TrueNAS machine. So obviously I have Proxmox running on the top one and TrueNAS running on the bottom one. So this video is going to be mostly about TrueNAS. And so this R510 here has 2 ZFS pools, physical pools of hard drives. One of them is a pool of, I think, 4 2 terabyte SAS drives, old SAS drives like this one here that came with these machines. Super ancient. They're still going, but they're well over 10 years old. And in the video later, I'll show you how many hours some of these have on them. And so that's running in a RAID 1, meaning one of those drives can fail, and I have 6 terabytes of total space. And then my bigger pool is more modern Western Digital and Seagate 4 terabyte NAS rated drives, and they're running in RAID Z2. So that means 2 of them can fail, and I have a total of 20 terabytes of usable space on that one. And now I'll go show you that setup. So my TrueNAS happens to be at 192.168.1.224 on my network, and this is what the main dashboard of TrueNAS looks like. Again, this isn't really a tutorial on how to set this up. There's tons of those online, like Lawrence Systems, and tons of other YouTubers have covered this. I'm just going to go over how I have it set up and what I'm using it for. So again, this is running on that Dell R510 with these old ancient Xeon enterprise CPUs. I upgraded this when I bought this machine. I think it had 16 gigs of RAM. I upgraded it to 64 gigs of RAM. I think it's like DDR3. It's a pretty old machine. And that helped. So you can see the way ZFS works. I have a huge amount of memory that it can cache data that's being pulled up from the spinning Rust hard disks, and it can immediately serve it from RAM. And so that's kind of a nice way to get a speed boost. I didn't measure the improvement I saw when I went from 16 to 64, or at least I didn't record the measurement, but I do remember, like, anecdotally, it felt faster when I was accessing the pool. And so to that end, I have 2 pools. One's called Gemini 1. You can give them names. One's called Gemini 1. One's called Gemini 2. The first one is made up of these super, 10 plus year old SAS drives. This is an IBM. I think all of them are 2 terabyte IBM X SAS drives. And so the first pool is 4 physical disks. And you can go look at that there in RAID Z1, meaning one of these disks can fail. And I have 6 terabytes of total space. So 2, 4, 6, and one of them can fail because it's replicating. And then in my other, this was the first pool I made. So I made this pool a couple years ago, and I did it because I had a bunch of these drives. I have 4 or 5 other 2 terabyte drives. So if one of them fails, I'm in good shape. The risk is if one of these fails, the other drives are going to go under a bunch of load to basically replicate all the stuff they have to the 4th drive you're replacing it with. And what can happen is that one of those drives could fail while that's happening. I've never had to do that, but I believe you're in pretty bad shape when that happens. So I'm kind of at risk with these older drives. I don't use this pool for anything important. I'll show you what's on there in a second. Then I've got my main pool, which is called Gemini 2 because I made it after Gemini 1. And it's got 8 4 terabyte drives. And it's running in RAID Z2. So that means that two of these physical disks can fail. They are brand new basically in the grand scheme of hard drives, spinning hard drives. So I'm not too worried. It's very easy to find equivalent 4 terabyte, 5,900 RPM disks. So I don't happen to have a spare on hand, but I'm probably going to buy a couple in case one of these goes down. I wouldn't have normally used RAID Z2. This is a pretty aggressive RAID setting, and I basically lost 4 terabytes of usable space by doing this for the physical setup I have. But I did it because I don't have a backup for this system. So I've backed it up once to S3 Glacier, and that's actually something you can do in TrueNAS. You can back your whole system up to a cloud provider regularly even. So I did a one-time backup about a year ago, and it cost me, I don't know, $5 a month on Amazon or something to have that stuff sitting in Glacier. I should probably do it again. It rips through your bandwidth. I started getting emails from Comcast about using too much of my upload bandwidth, but that's why I went with this more aggressive RAID setup because I don't have anywhere I'm backing this up to. So in an ideal world, you have your data in 3 places, and one of those places is physically separated and different from the other 2. And so right now, all my stuff is in that closet you just saw, and I'm not backing it up anywhere else except for that one-time Glacier upload I did. So what I'm going to do going forward is I'm probably going to turn this thing into my backups backup, and I'll build a more power efficient, from scratch server with modern components, bigger hard drives. So it's kind of ridiculous to need, I think I have 12 hard drives in there for a total usable space of 26 terabytes. That's kind of wild. So what I'm going to do going forward is buy really high capacity drives, maybe like probably a RAID 1, 4 drives or something. That'll be my main NAS, and then I'll back those up to this thing. It's kind of my thinking. Or I'm kind of sentimental about this thing. I might just keep this. So that's those are the pools. That machine has 2 1 gigabit Ethernet NICs built in. That's what these interface links are here. I don't use them, obviously. I have them disabled. And I installed a 10 gigabit NIC. And it goes into that aggregate switch, that Unify aggregate switch. And it actually connects to the Proxmox server via that 10 gig link. These both have 10 gig cards. And you can see it's doing a pretty minimal amount of stuff right here. All right, so here we are over in Proxmox. And Proxmox is what's called a hypervisor, meaning it's software that can run virtual machines on one piece of physical hardware, or multiple if you're in a high availability setup. I just have one server running Proxmox right now. And so again, I'll make another video totally dedicated to what I've got going on here, what Proxmox is all about, things I like about it, why I chose it, what all these VMs are doing, and so on. But what's interesting for the TrueNAS instance is that you can see this Proxmox server has over 20 terabytes of storage available to it. And that's because I actually mounted the TrueNAS server to this Proxmox server. And so if we go over and look at storage, I think I mentioned earlier, there's something like 2 terabytes of disks in a RAID 0. They're SSDs, so they're super fast on the Proxmox server. So a lot of the VMs are running on this storage pool. But what's more interesting is that I actually mounted, it's called AwesomeNAS. That's just the name of the TrueNAS server I was just showing you mounted on this Proxmox server. I actually mounted that to this. And so Proxmox can take full advantage of all that storage for the VMs. And so I can use this pretty beefy Proxmox server with its 32 CPUs, its 192 gigs of RAM, 188, available anyway. It can use the TrueNAS server for storage, and I don't have to waste space on this one. And so we can actually spin one up. So again, I'll make a more dedicated video about this, but if I go and create a VM, we'll call it, I don't know, TrueNAS video. You'll see that the storage media is also NAS, and I can actually host all the ISOs, VM images I'd like to launch on the TrueNAS server. I don't have to waste my more expensive, better, faster SSD space, to host my Fedora workstation Linux distribution image, right? And so I can actually set up a special folder on TrueNAS that Proxmox will look at, and I can put all these ISOs in here. And so, for example, we'll choose that Fedora one, and that should be fine. And then here, I can choose to host the storage for this VM on the local faster SSDs in the Proxmox instance, or I can just host it right off the NAS over the network. And that's why I did the 10 gig link between the two. And you'll see that you don't even notice that it's going over the network. And so we'll stick with the NAS, and then let's give ourselves a chance of actually seeing this thing boot. We'll give it 2 sockets, 4 cores. Let's give it, I don't know, 8 gigs of RAM. That should be fine. And then here's the VM we just created. Let's start it up. And so this is actually booting. So it's already booted. So the disk for this VM lives on that TrueNAS server, a different physical machine than this Proxmox instance. Let's start it up. And in my experience, most of these VMs are on the local SSDs to the Proxmox server. But I've been experimenting, namely with this 107 one, this worker NAS one, meaning it's my naming convention, meaning it's on the NAS. And I've been pretty impressed. So like here, as I'm talking, this VM is already booting up into Fedora, and it's over the network, and you wouldn't even know it. Like, this is a pretty reasonable speed for a brand new VM to be booting up from its image. So yeah, that's a really cool use case I've found for running a hypervisor. Doesn't need to be Proxmox. It could probably be any hypervisor. And being able to leverage all the storage you've built on your TrueNAS instance. And so I'll show you something else here. So if we open up Explorer and we navigate to 1.224, which is my TrueNAS instance, you can see we see the two shares, Gemini 1 and 2. We'll talk about Plex in a second. And we go over here to Gemini 2, and this is where I store all my stuff, really. We can go over to template, ISO, and these are those ISOs in that dropdown we saw for Proxmox. So I can mount this, and Proxmox will look at the template / ISO path for VM images when you're starting a new VM. And so this is great. Like this is 25 gigs of space I don't need to waste on the Proxmox instance, and I can just host them here. And so what that looks like over in TrueNAS is, I think in services, I've got NFS turned on so that I can mount this store as NFS. And then, and again, this isn't really a tutorial. It's more of a inspirational video to show you that, what you could do with this thing. And then I've got SMB turned on, which lets me actually navigate through the NAS here, in Explorer or on my Mac. So another thing I do is I have a MacBook that I use for work upstairs. If I need to move large files or anything really at all, from that machine to this machine or any machines in my network, I can just log in. I auto log in on Windows with this, but I can just mount 192.168.1.224 and put it wherever I want. I think I mentioned I was going to show you on the Gemini 1 share, I've got some backups of some hard drives and some old machines. So, this thing is an old MacBook I backed up. This is some Minecraft server backup stuff. Everything here is also on Gemini 2. Not automatically, but I've synced them because I don't trust these older disks quite as much, and there's not as much redundancy. And so Gemini 1 was really just like an exploratory area for me to play around. I still use it, so if I'm just transferring a file around, I'll throw it on this one. Like I must have been messing around last year. I don't even know what this is, but and And then another one is Plex. So here is my Plex server. And years ago, I ripped a bunch of DVDs. And that's what's in this movies folder. I think, let's see how big it is. Windows might not want to grind on that, but it's probably the vast majority of the 3 terabytes that I'm using on Gemini 2. And so if you go over here, TrueNAS actually has a bunch of plugins. So you can actually make TrueNAS act like an S3 server, all sorts of stuff. And so the one plugin I'm running is Plex. And if you don't know what Plex is, it's a free and open source tool for hosting your media, basically. So these are these DVDs years ago that I ripped in way too low of quality because I didn't have a 20 terabyte pool at the time. I had like a 2 terabyte drive or something. But yeah, so you can rip all your media and host it on Plex. You can host Plex. I could be hosting Plex on Proxmox or whatever, but I played around with TrueNAS, and TrueNAS has a bunch of different plugins for backing things up. Syncthing is another backup option, and it's just kind of worked. So I'm actually using TrueNAS as a hypervisor in a way. Like this is a VM running, on my TrueNAS instance hosting Plex, which is another really cool use case. And so another way I'm using this is, you'll see I have this ROMs folder, all sorts of ROMs. And so one example is I have this PS2 here that I apparently bought for $14.99 once upon a time. Don't know if you can do that now. And it's got the modem on the back. And you can get some hardware on this and play some games and eventually get it to boot off of a NAS, basically. So I pulled my hair out for a week or something. And that's another cool thing you can do. So basically I can plug that into my network. It'll boot. It'll start looking for my TrueNAS instance. And in the PS2 folder, it'll find the games and it'll load those up. And so the possibilities are endless. You can do all sorts of interesting things with a NAS other than just storage. And it's fun to play with. And so hopefully that gives you some ideas. And now I'll talk about a couple of the problems I have and things I would have done differently. All right, so let's talk about some of the problems with my setup. One of them is maybe an opportunity, which is that, however you look at it, which is that I'm kind of reusing some pretty old hardware. And so this is one of the 2 terabyte SAS drives. It's probably about 10 years old. And if we ask it what it's been up to, it's got 69,000 hours of uptime, or it's been powered on for 69,000 hours. And so that's something like 7 to 8 years this thing has been running. And so Gemini 1, that pool that has 4 2 terabyte drives, they're all about the same. They've been running for about 8 years straight, probably in an enterprise setting. I don't know how abused they were getting, how much activity they were under. But yeah, they've been up for a long time. And so that's one, I guess I'll call it an issue or a downside, is I am running some older hardware. It was kind of the point. So I have a lot more of these drives. I've got a ton of 1 terabyte SAS drives that I'd like to make an array out of someday if I could figure out a cost-effective way to do it from a power perspective. But yeah, so that's one thing. I think I promised I would show that. So yeah, one of the drives in that pool has been on for 7 or 8 years total, nonstop. And then another thing is I'm SSH'd into the TrueNAS right now. If I take a look at all the drives, you can see I've got the 4 terabytes and the 2 terabytes. If I scroll up to the boot drive, you'll see it's this 250 gigabyte SSD. It's the boot drive, and there's one of them. So I set this up a long time ago, and I was super excited, and I told myself, oh yeah, when I set it up for real, I'll get some redundancy on the boot drive. Never did that. So that's like a huge issue with my installation. And so how I've been getting around that, instead of doing the right thing, which is to start over and do it right, I've been in TrueNAS, in the system general, you can save the config. So I've never actually had to back up from this config, but regularly I download this config in case I ever have a catastrophic issue with that boot drive. And so that's something I would recommend. Is I haven't really found good information out there about what to do about this. I would imagine I should have set it up in some sort of RAID 1 with another drive, on the machine, so that at least one of my boot drives could fail and I wouldn't lose all this. But in the meantime, I've been saving the config. So yeah, I'd be curious to know if anyone has any better ideas or what you should do there, because that's what I've been doing, and I know it's probably not good enough, especially since this is my one source of truth. And aside from the ZFS pool redundancy I've got with the RAID setups, I really don't have any redundancy beyond that until I build my second NAS, basically. So yeah, that's one of the biggest downsides. Think about how you're going to set up your boot drive. That's just as important as the actual storage media you're setting up and the redundancy you have there, I think. So that's an overview of how I'm using TrueNAS in my home lab. And that'll be episode 1 of at least 2 in my home lab, and how I'm using it and why I've got it. And I just wanted to throw out there, like, don't be intimidated because I've got like this network rack with these big enterprise machines. And also remember, like, they're old. They're 10 plus years old. They're not technically impressive. They're power hungry. It might not be the best way to do it. I'm using super old hard drives and stuff like that. The whole point is you should have something where you can play around, and you don't need this like wild setup I've got. So like a Raspberry Pi can be a home lab. Your old laptop is a home lab. I would recommend, if you don't have anything and you want to get into this and you want to learn more about computers and servers and networking, go to Goodwill or a thrift store, buy the cheapest router you can find, buy the cheapest network switch, buy the cheapest computer you can find. And I guarantee you'll be able to install Linux on it and get it serving something. And that's your home lab. Like, the whole point is that you have a place that you can play, and it's not your main machine that you need for work or something. And you can wipe the hard drive, replace the hard drive, upgrade something or downgrade whatever. And it's just a place for you to play and learn and figure stuff out and have fun. Like, it doesn't need to be as involved as the examples I'm giving. So for the longest time, I would play with, physical machines and install different OSs on them. And over many, many years, decades, I've graduated to where I'm doing that in a virtualized setting in something like Proxmox on a bigger machine. It doesn't have to be that way. So yeah, I hope this sort of inspired you, especially for, a general home lab perspective, and definitely, what you could do with a NAS. Like I kind of alluded to earlier when I was showing the PS2, like when I set up this TrueNAS, I never thought I would be hooking a PS2 up to it. But when I found out that a PS2 could boot from a NAS, I was like, I have a NAS. Let's try to figure that out. And so that's kind of the whole point. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you in the next one.